Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all there. Hey, Tad. Hey, Chris. Hey, Penny, Linda, Joelle from Hudson Valley. I love the Hudson Valley. So can somebody give me the sign that you can see me and hear me? Hey, Cynthia. Indiana. I'm reading a mystery that's set in Indiana. Maddie Day. It's a really good series. All good. Okay, great. So I got going last night again. I'm going to start right in because I got I got a rabbit hole thing going last night that was so crazy, a rug rabbit hole that took me to the craziest places. And I want to share them because I want to make sure I can get everything in one episode. It was such a good rabbit's hole. It was like a whole warren under there. I started looking at a little book that I kept on the bedside, and I only had a little energy. So I took a little book. Hey, Olivia. And it's this little book. And I'm not necessarily recommending it at all. It's a very little book. It was printed in 1950, and it's called The American Arts Library, American Rugs. So it's part of a, hey, good morning, Cynthia. It's part of a library of books on early American things. And it's written by Estelle Rise, R-I-E. And again, hey, good morning, Linda. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but it is such an interesting book for a few reasons. And I hope that you like this. This is going to be a heavy history episode about early rugs because we've touched on early rugs at least twice this week. We touched on them with this amazing book from yesterday, the Primitive Hooked Rugs book, because in here, she often refers to colonial rugs. Remember this page we looked at yesterday with the horse and then the horse redone? This amazing book by Cynthia Norwood. She's referring in this book, see, this is the back of this rug because people would often do that to protect it if they loved it. And it was the back of this rug, actually, the original. If they loved it, they would back it to save it a little longer or use it as a piece of wall art. But she refers to colonial rugs that way, colonial rugs, because there is no such thing as colonial rugs. And so this book took me down the hole of misinformation, but it was not only charming, it was interesting because we know so much between this book and this book about the history of rugs. It has come together in so many ways over the decades that that little book by Estelle is super cute, and I'm going to tap into it for sure. Hi, April. But it's full of misinformation, and it is part of history because it's what people read and were told and believed at that time with the information that they had at that time. So today we're talking about old rugs, really old rugs. And to be honest, it's amazing that any of them survive because if you think about it, they were made from scraps. They were made on homespun, which was probably linen, until burlap was being manufactured. And then that was actually better than the homespun they were making. And they were put down often on dirt floors, not that long ago, right? Because I remember my grandmother's house in the barn on the property in Warren, Rhode Island. They lived in the barn, like until they built the big house in the 20th century. And that house had a dirt floor. I mean, that was in the early 20th century and they were not wealthy. But I mean, that's not even a rural area. That's outside Providence. So these rugs survived not only dirt floors, a lot of wear, not the best, necessarily the best supplies, materials went into them, but they also survived that thing in the 1920s that we talked about on the Hutchinson episode, where people became so invested in manufactured goods because they were available and they were cheap. And when that happened, people did not want to see the old junk. It wasn't charming. It wasn't handmade. It was something old that had holes in it, that was damaged, that was a sign of poorer, harder times. And people would certainly have thrown out rugs most of the time. It's like a cat coming out of the litter box. You know, they do their business. They're out like a flash. They don't want anything to do with what just happened, and they move on to the next thing. So it's a miracle that any of these old rugs have even survived. So knowing that, I gave myself some notes because it's that good of an episode. Knowing that we do have some good examples of early rugs, but none of them are colonial. Some of them are colonial. None of the hooked ones are colonial. So in these older books, they're referring to colonial rugs, and it is misinformation, colonial hooked rugs. There are other kinds of rugs. If you remember, I think last week we talked about the shirred rugs, which is like when you do like a caterpillar thing on top, you sew a strip of fabric with a stitch down the middle, and then you ruche it, and then you sew down the ruching. And that's called a shirred rug. And that existed. And of course, things that were woven could exist as imports or have been taken from Europe or other places to the US. There was not going to be any manufacturing in colonial times, things with looms, places that were manufacturing big time rugs and things like that wasn't happening yet. But then there were other kinds of rugs. We talked about like bed rugs, which were partial carpets, embroidered rugs, which are glorified embroideries, rugs made with yarn that were often called sewn rugs. These are all earlier rugs than hooked rugs, but they're all important in the timeline of things. Now, also knitted rugs, right? When you have remember I took out those balls the other day that I found at an antique store? It was like ribbon that someone had ripped off multiple garments or blankets or whatever and wound them into balls. And I had 6 or 8 of them. I got it at an antique store for $6 for all of them. The reason those are so popular, and you see in folk art magazines and in folk art websites, people with a big wooden bowl filled with those balls of fabric that they sewed together into strips to later use, was because that is authentic. So you could make a knitted rug that way, or you could make a yarn rug that way. Anything that you were going to sew, you would make that way. And people would collect these giant balls of fabric that they would sew together to use later. Knitted rugs, there's examples that the pieces that they were knitting with, the strips, were up to 6 inches wide. So that would be so hard on your hands and wrists. Good morning. Braided rugs is the next one. That's my favorite. Thank you for the lead in. I know it's a poverty thing that people would have these rugs, be making these rugs. And my grandmother too, she was a great crocheter. She never got into rug making, which is a shame, because that would have meant I would have much earlier, 40 years earlier. But good morning, Julie. So all of these earlier forms of rugs have their place, but the reason we don't hear about them as often, or they're not important to American history, is because it is the American rugs that are distinctly North American. So although we can't specifically yet put them at, Nova Scotia, Labrador, or Northern New England, which maybe the pieces will fall into place like they have with other things from the 1950s till now, that might at some point fall into place. But it's hard to pinpoint right now and say either way. But certainly hooked rugs are North American. And even in this book, she's referring to, remember I said yesterday, there are some people who believe that rug hooking goes back to Egyptian times and or Scandinavian, specifically Swedish culture. But those rugs, because all of these early rugs are so damaged, so threadbare, it's very hard to tell the technique on some of them. Very hard to tell the difference sometimes between an embroidered rug or piece or a yarn rug that's been sewn. Very hard, even looking at it close up. And certainly up till now, the confusion was even more. So things get called things that they aren't, and it creates confusion. But the other reason these other kinds of rugs are not as well known is because they never reached a peak in terms of popularity. Rug hooking did, right? The post-Civil War period. So the high Victorian period, the 1860s to the 1920s, was certainly a peak. Everybody knew what it was. Most women were aware of it and or did lots of it. These other forms of rug making never hit a peak. So it would be more of an isolated thing if in your community more people knew how to sew rugs or do whatever, different shirred rugs, different kinds of rugs. That would probably be what you would jump on the bandwagon with. But hooked rugs were the first type of homemade rug that really had a peak, and it's very visible and it's very easy to track historically. So that's part of our story. So the last kind of hooked rug that is right on the border of interest before we get into hooked rugs are called tongue rugs, or sometimes petal rugs. And these are more recognizable to us now as more of an applique, like a quilting applique type thing. So for example, this is a tongue rug, later called petal rug. I think they called it that because it was pretty gauche calling it a tongue rug. It's basically your scraps cut into scallop shapes and sewn together. And in the middle, this looks hooked, but it's actually embroidered. So this is an early tongue rug or petal rug. They're extremely collectible if they're early to mid 19th century. This is another example of a tongue rug with the back showing. So let me show you the top. people sometimes call these penny rugs now when they're done with wool. And you would have finished edges like this one is. You wouldn't have to finish them. The first one was not wool. It was probably silks or rayon. So they had to finish the edges with some kind of a binding to prevent it from fraying. But as you can imagine, this would be really impractical as a rug on a dirt floor. This too is really pushing it. But you work with what you've got, right? So the tongue rugs and the petal rugs also do not reach a peak, but are known. The next form of rug that became popular, particularly in New England first, is and there are other rugs, other families of rugs that if we have time at the end, I'll go to the tufting family of rugs. There's a category of 4, but we'll see how it goes. Braiding. So thank you for bringing up braiding already. That is exactly where I'm going with this. And I really hope to do some stuff on braiding in the near future. I'm not a big braider at all, so I'd love for somebody to teach me how to do it. Maybe I can come over and have a little class if you're somewhere around. I did that yesterday with Heather in our group. She was showing me Prati, and we had a great afternoon doing that together, video on the way. But I want to get more into braiding and learn more about braiding because I know about it academically, but not as much practically, and I would love to get better at it. So braiding comes in, and this is yet another way to use scrap wool. So thanks, Michelle. I love knowing that you're there. This is another way to use your scraps. And the plus to braiding, of course, is that you don't have to be particularly creative to do it. The minus is if you are creative, it's going to be in really unfulfilling form because it has no sort of pictorial quality to it. It's just the braid. So pluses and minuses, but again, you get what you get and you don't get upset, right? That is like an eternal thing. So the braided rugs are made from scraps. And this is where, Teddy, I'm recording a video. This is where the big rabbit hole thing comes in because I got into this last night. So I'm going to make no, it's okay. It's okay. The dog got his toy. So I'm going to make a connection back to the Hutchinson rugs, because remember when we were talking about that, and I was talking about when rugs were available commercially and you could buy them and you could afford to buy them because of the times. You would want to buy them instead of make them. So braided rugs braided and hooked rugs starting in the 1920s were they had not been a thing since the late Victorian period. In the 1920s, they were having a renaissance because the pendulum swung. This is just a recap. And people were interested in non-industrial everything, handcrafts, everything. And the main person that I didn't mention then, and I kicked myself that night when I was thinking about it in bed for not mentioning, and I'm so glad now that I didn't mention, because almost this whole theme is about him, is nothing to do with hooked rugs, but it's Wallace Nutting. Now, do you know already who Wallace Nutting is? Because if you don't, you should go down a rabbit hole right after this. He is going to be such an important player in the history of rugs for us. Many people who love antiquing already know about him because he was a very famous photographer at the beginning of the 20th century. Very early photographs, 1920s really is his peak, but he's doing colored photographs. And his most famous and collectible ones are interiors, and he is very well known. And he is the man who invented the idea of early America. He invented, and I'm doing this again, the colonial look. And this includes rugs. So I'm going to show you some examples of his photographs, right? Maybe you recognize him now. Look at the braided rugs in his photograph. I'm going to show you these again. Here's another one. Look at this really elaborate one with like a 5-point at the center. Those are the really tricky ones. I'm going to show you these again. I'm just making a little segue here. I'm not going to show you that one yet. But yeah, there's another beautiful rug under there. So the thing about Nutting is this. He becomes such an important person to rug making, not necessarily rug hooking, but rug making, because there's no real evidence. There's 1 or 2 rugs in his photos that could be hooked, but he's mostly showing braided rugs. He's showing a lot of rugs. Now, what happens with Nutting to set this up is that the event that's gonna start this whole story is in 1876. So, sorry, 1875. So it's going to be in Philadelphia. They have their 76, their centennial celebration, which was like an early World's Fair. And when they had this in Philadelphia, people came even in that time period from all over the country, like literally all over the country. It was like the biggest World's Fair before World's Fairs. It was a crazy event. It was to celebrate the 100 years of us being America. By the way, did you notice this? Now we're 400 years. This isn't one of my shirts. I got this in Provincetown. 400 years now. But this was at 100 years. Thousands, tens of thousands of people came. It was a crazy event right in Philadelphia. And it celebrated technology. It was like a period where there was something new being created every single day, some new invention every day, and life was exciting. Now we feel like that now, but these were really visible inventions that improved daily life. This was like a magical moment in history. But at that centennial celebration, they had a huge exhibit that became arguably the most popular exhibit at the fair that celebrated the first years of America. So they were showing colonial crafts and historic furniture and everything from the last 100 years. People were pulling stuff out of their garages and their attics and their grandmother's houses and bringing them to the fair to exhibit. And people were so interested in this because our country was 100 years old and we had no pedigree. And this fair with this show established pedigree for us. We suddenly had history. It was something that we could own, something that we could see, something that we could measure with 100 years. I can't emphasize from reading about this period in history how important this fair was. The fair is part of the reason the pendulum swung and got everybody interested in old handcrafts and colonial era everything. So this is the thing that makes everybody start feeling like they want to reconnect with the early settlement days. Now, they were using the word colonial incorrectly, right? Because the colonial settlement, the colonial period only goes through the revolution. So we're more than 100 years out of the colonial period by the time this fair happens. But people are just referring as an umbrella to the past as the colonial period. And everything about it is popular. So Wallace Nutting is only like 15 at the time of the fair. Everybody's affected by the fair, whether they went there or not. He's in Massachusetts, so he probably went. But because it wasn't that far away, all things considered. I mean, people came from across the Mississippi to go to this fair. People came from Europe to go to this fair. So it was a big deal and it can't be overstated. So as he got older, he was still interested in history, but he became a congregational minister and it did not go well. He didn't have a very good temperament by the sound of it, just looking at like his biographical information a little bit. I used to cover all this stuff when I was a tour guide. That's why it's like in the front of my head. But he was a difficult person. And I don't know how we would diagnose him by today's standards, but he seemed very depressed. He had constant crippling headaches. He had severe mood swings. I know you're coming up with some words already, and I was too. And he was very up and down and very difficult emotionally. So he was not suited to be a minister and deal with other people's problems and give a lot of himself. He wasn't there. So his wife, funnily enough, suggested that for his moods and headaches, he start bicycling and getting out of the house. That sounds like a really good idea for this person, right? So he gets a bike and he starts traveling around, time check, his immediate area, which is Massachusetts, and it's beautiful. And he starts taking up photography as he bikes. And on one particular rainy day, he experimented with taking photos of an interior because of the rain of a colonial house. And this is where it all starts. So he will do hundreds and hundreds of photos of actual colonial houses, but start staging them with braided rugs, colonial furniture, and making colonial scenes. And then he will have these women dressed up in colonial getups. Some of them are correct, some of them are not at all. And this is how popular he becomes. In 1904, he publishes a 97-page catalog with 900 images. Almost all of them have rugs in them. He is making $1,000 a day in 1904. His prints are selling for between $1.25 each and $20 each, depending on size. He opens a gallery in New York City the same year because he's got the funds. He hires 200 colorists who color all of his photos and sign his name. So beware, because nothing that you'll find of his is going to be signed by him. It's going to be signed by a colorist. All of these are called colonials, right? So he is a master of marketing, and he is inventing the colonial look which is very rug heavy. It's not necessarily authentic, but it's quaint, and it is helping people reconnect to their partially invented past, right? Because this is not a typical colonial scene, right? Standing in the doorway waiting to be attacked by the French or by native people or by your neighbors or by animals was more accurate. This is more like a 1900s window of what it must have looked like to be quaint and have a bright room to sit in the colonial days. So it wasn't quite correct, but he does, along with a lot of other people who are parts of this arts and crafts movement, he does help us hugely to establish a national identity for Americans. So this is a really big moment in history. Now, the first carpet company, I'm keeping an eye on the time, in the U.S. has already sprung up by the time the Philadelphia Exposition happens. It happens in 1791. Sprague, last name Sprague, I forget his first name, I think it was William, sets up, again in Philadelphia, a carpet company where he manufactures carpets. Now, the first carpet was called finger tufted, which probably means handmade. And it was made with our new coat of arms, brand new coat of arms for the US. And it was made custom for the Senate chamber floor. And it had, again, our Republic coat of arms. I'm going to show you that this is the worst photo, but I'm not even sure the rug is around anymore. They reproduced it a few times. I'm not sure it's still there, but this was a coat of arms. So this is the first rug making factory in the US, and this is the first rug that hits the Senate floor. Now, here's something so interesting. It's obviously a neoclassical style rug, very formal compared to what comes next with rug making that's super formal. Alexander Hamilton of Hamilton the Music and of the duel with Burr getting killed that way, that Alexander Hamilton admires the rug. And he, as a result of admiring this rug, he establishes rug making in the US as a cottage industry. When he did that legally at that time, what that meant in terms of repercussion was that because it was a cottage industry in the US, even though there was one company doing it, because it was, the government could then impose a tariff or tax on anybody who bought an imported rug. So you want a rug to come from England, you can buy it, but you're going to pay a lot in tax to have it imported because now Americans make rugs. So it's a little bit of a cheat, and it's an interesting angle that he would do this so early after one rug. But I think it's super, super interesting. Now, this guy, Sprague, who made the rug, we know he was actually an Englishman who immigrated here, and he was born in 1750 in Axminster. And we think almost certainly that he was an apprentice to Thomas Whitey in Axminster. Now, he worked at the Axminster Rug Company. And this is the actual, I found this down the rabbit hole. This is the actual ad that he had in the paper around this time that the Senate hired him to do this rug. He writes, and this is the Pennsylvania Gazette, orders received by Peter William Sprague of Burlington for any size, figure, shape, of American floor and beside carpets, wove after, this doesn't make perfect English anymore, wove after the Axminster mode, which for softness, warmth, and duration exceed anything of the kind ever attempted in this country. A few of both floor and bedside carpets are now for sale in 3rd Street at the store of Richard Wills and Son, where Jersey paper money will be taken for them. So we don't even have the mint yet, where we have like standardized money, Jersey paper money. But isn't it curious and funny that he worked at this not at all famous or prestigious Axminster rug company in his hometown, and then when he's here, he puts out an ad and refers to like the famous Axminster mode of rug making. It is just so, I think it is so charming and so funny. So I'm gonna hold that thought there, because that brings us pretty much up to the next thing I want to show you. I might go over by 1 minute, but we'll see how it goes. This book is good for a few things. I'm going to get back to the story, but this is an excellent example I found this morning of a rug with a commercial border that somebody's filled in the center of with like a farm, probably their own farm. This book is good for pictures. This is another rug from the book. This is actually another government seal. It looks like a whale's tooth, but it's another government seal, which goes to show how important using sort of patriotic motifs was at this point. being a new country and celebrating the 100 years was super, super important. So the next thing I want to hit on is the trend for collecting rugs. And I'm going to read you a passage because rugs were, as you know, super in. And at a certain point early on in their history, they became super collectible. And this is another reason why they're scarce and hard to find, is because they were snapped up a long time ago. So later in this book, I'm reading from this book, I want to read you this passage. And I'm going to show you this rug because she is making a really bold point, and I want you to stick with me, and I hope I don't go too far over. This is the rug here with the star and the anchor and the heart that we're referring to, because this is another big chapter in rug history. So she says, on page 56 of this book will be found the illustration of an early American symbolic hooked rug, that's that one, which may be said to have initiated the interest in, if not the craze for, antique American hooked rugs. When Mr. James Shoemaker, the famous rug connoisseur, saw that rug I just showed you, thrown over a battered old sea chest a good many years ago, he was immediately intrigued by it. It was a rug which had been made by a sailor in the idle hours of a long voyage, measuring 1 foot 10 inches by 1 foot 8 inches. A heart in one corner, an anchor in another, and a star in the center were all symbolic of the maker's thoughts and aspirations. The colors are red, lavender, sapphire blue, and tan. This rug touched Mr. Shoemaker's imagination. He saw not only design, but immediately realized that many of the people who enjoyed, used, or collected early American furniture, the Nutting group, right, would find just the supplement they needed in an antique rug. So, thus, he started traveling around New England, inquiring casually about neglected rugs lying around in careless indifference in all kinds of unlikely places. Many he picked up for a bagatelle. Now, bagatelle in this sense, bagatelle is a game, but in this in the mid-century, it meant like for nothing, like for a song. He picked these rugs up for a bagatelle, and he turned over to a couple of elderly New England women to clean them and repair them. So he's got a business started already. So before long, Mr. Shoemaker had about 600 such rugs. His immediate task was to get the public attention focused upon them. Mr. Shoemaker has told me that he tried first to get a rug buyer in New York, a large New York department store, to take them over for resale. But the buyer, who was accustomed to handling only rich Orientals, thought Mr. Shoemaker must be crazy to offer him these, and he said as much. He flatly refused to invest a cent in them. Mr. Shoemaker then prevailed upon him to display them, or a few of them, in Fifth Avenue windows of his department store, and also to set apart a few square feet in the rug department for some of them. The buyer agreed to take about 300 of the rugs only on consignment, that is, without paying anything or making any commitment. The display was ready on a Monday morning. The following Friday, the buyer from the department store came breathlessly to Mr. Shoemaker's place with a check for the entire 300 rugs and an order for any more that he might have available. The craze was on, ! And that's where this passage ends. The craze was on. And this really, and I want to show you, I also found, this is a different rabbit hole, same thing this morning. I found that advertisement online. Fine old not hooked, rugs will be shown here. James M. Shoemaker collection on exhibition Thursday at Anderson Galleries. So this isn't the department store one, but this is 1923, April 29, 1923. I've got to wrap it up in a minute. But what this means is, do you remember, and I'm so sad that I'm not old enough to remember the golden age of the department store. Selfridge, right? And even later, 20th century department store. This is my other huge passion in life besides hooked rugs. I've been researching like defunct department stores, 20th century ones, for like years. So my passions cross over right here, and this is why I get crazy. But do you remember when, now you would have to be much older to remember this, I'm almost 50. Department stores used to have galleries in them where you could go for free and look at exhibits. And they were moving exhibits. They served as museums. You didn't have to pay a cent. You could come in and browse and shop and look at exhibits. So what Shoemaker is describing is an exhibit that he had put up, not just in the windows, but they were exhibiting rugs in a department store as part of a public function. And every department store did this. And this must have been amazing to go to these old department stores and sit at the counter and have their special soup or whatever their special pie was, and then to go to an exhibit and see whatever they had to show you, whether it was Wedgwood or hooked rugs. But what an exciting time in history this must have been, and what a huge success this particular exhibit was. And also, I'm almost sarcastically saying, thank you, Mr. Shoemaker, because you saved hundreds and hundreds of rugs. But he also started the craze for collecting, and it started that long ago, since the 1920s, right? Going back to the Hutchinson episode, people have been like ferociously, aggressively collecting hooked rugs. And that's why it's hard to find really good ones, but you still do find them in antique stores. But what a business he had going. I was going to say racket, but it wasn't. It was fair enough. And he did save them after all. So we are out of time, but I hope you enjoyed that episode. I didn't even look at comments. Like, comment, subscribe, please, to keep the channel going. I need to know that people are looking. I work really hard on these episodes. Hi, Mom. You are so welcome. I hope that was interesting for you. I just can't get enough. I can't get enough. I have to look at some more of my department store books and see, you know what else they had at department stores? And I'm going to stop. In the rug department, they had antique rugs. So when Shoemaker's saying, put some of my rugs down with the Oriental rugs in the rug department, they had antiques. Most department stores had an antique department where they actually like had an antique store within the department store that somebody managed who was an expert. I wish it was those days still. I really do. But it's these days, and it's Friday. So have a wonderful weekend. I'll try to come up with something great for you for next week. This will be our last Friday coffee time at this time. Next week, we're going to run Monday to Thursday coffee time at this time, and on Friday, cocktail time. And I'm shooting for that. I'll confirm it with you, but I'm shooting for that at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So next Friday, cocktail time. But between now and then, Monday through Thursday, coffee time. See you then. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.